Hello, everybody. Welcome. I think we've still got a few people joining from the virtual waiting room, but we're going to get started. I'm Peter Spilsbury, Director of the Strategy Unit, and I'm really pleased to be welcoming you to what is the finale, the last session of the Insight 2020 Festival. It's the 33rd session, which I know for the guys who've been involved in running this represents a sigh of relief that it's the finale. But anyway, so today we're bringing together many of the themes from the whole festival, which has gone on over 6 weeks. And we're doing that with a terrific panel of wise people who I'll introduce to you in a little bit, but they're just listed there. And we're going to talk about the nature of decision making in the new world of integrated systems. And we're going to talk about what it should be rather than perhaps what it is. But before we get into that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time, maybe hopefully a bit less than 15 minutes, just reviewing what's gone on so far in the festival to set the scene for this discussion. But just before we do that, the usual, I think everyone's very familiar with these instructions these days, but if you could keep your microphone muted, it would help. It would be really nice if you could just put in the chat now who you are and where you work and where you are, because it's a way for us to understand the audience, if you like. And then as we go through the discussion, please do post questions, because there's about half an hour towards the end when we will be having a discussion when we can draw on questions from the chat. So please do put questions in. The session's being recorded, and everyone who's participated will get a link to that, but also it'll become part of the resource of the Decision Support Centre library for the future. And anyone who does some of these things at the end, which I have to admit I don't never understand, but if you do these things on social media and you feel inclined to promote the fact this is going on, then we'd really appreciate it. So the Insights 2020 Festival came about as one way to mark the beginnings of the Midlands Decision Support Unit network. But it also came about because in what are very challenging times, we wanted to try to offer some spaces for reflection and learning, and some opportunities where we could share insights from some of the work that we've done over the last period in the strategy unit, but more critically really to create an opportunity to share the insights and learning of some of the really great people we've had the privilege to work with over the last few years. All of the sessions have been recorded. I think bar one, actually, all of the sessions have been recorded, and as I say, do represent a resource, and some of them in particular I think really are worth people's time going back to look at, perhaps particularly from the week on inequalities, actually. It's kind of become a joke in our team, but it is sort of true, that this festival was going to be one day, and then I went on holiday, and when I came back, they turned it into a 6-week festival. But the reason for that, partly it was because the opportunity of doing stuff online made that more feasible, but it was also because we just had too much good stuff to fit in, and we just didn't want to miss some of it out. And the energy and the enthusiasm of my really fantastic team have made it happen, and I'm very proud of that, and I'm very proud of what they've done in doing this festival. So our objective was learning and creating a space for learning, and in a way only time will tell how much we've succeeded in that for others. But I know, I mean, I've been lucky, I've gone on quite a few of the sessions, and I can tell you for certain that some of these sessions have changed the way I think about the world. So the session, for instance, that Karen Bradley ran on gender inequalities was quite a transforming moment for me, actually. And that's just one example. So anyway, the way the festival went. So in the first week, we had the sort of theme of decision-making context. And we started off with a bit of bang, actually. I don't know if people know Ben Goldacre, but he's quite a fun speaker. He shouts a lot while he's presenting. But Ben from Oxford University, he's published a paper recently on the future of analytics in the health setting, healthcare, and he's quite a well-known media personality on that anyway. And he led off a session talking about, which in effect made a powerful case, I think, for why we're doing this decision support unit stuff across the Midlands. And I think in the chat, the paper that he led, it was a lot of contributors, including Mohammed from our team, actually, but we're putting the that we've missed a lot of things that were really necessary. And the fact that that 50% reduction happened across all types of activity and all levels of complexity makes it an even more complicated question. So we then got to week 2, where we talked about, this was a bit more Midlands specific. So here we were talking about the decision support network and some of the things that come with that. So we had an introductory session with Paul Mobach, who hopefully will be joining us soon to be on the panel today, who's chairing that network, and various other people talking about some of the challenges of getting decision support units going and the rationale for the network. And we had sessions on some specific elements of it. So we had Alison Turner from the strategy unit, who's the knowledge lead for the decision support centre, talking about evidence. We had Paul Mason, who's the evaluation lead, talking about the new evaluation network that we're setting up. And at that session, we published the evaluation guide for the Midlands Decision Support Network. And that again is in the chat. That's a really great resource for pointing people at all sorts of knowledge and resources to support effective evaluation. And then Stephen Wyatt, who's the chief analyst for the Decision Support Centre, talking about the analyst network and how we make that work. Week 3 was about the analytical priorities that the network settled on. So the first session talked about how the first 3 of those have been selected and how we're approaching them. There were big emphasis on health inequalities in those projects. We then had a session on the qualitative findings from an evaluation of how services have changed in response to COVID in Hereford and Worcester. And at that point, I think also we published a paper on how to learn effectively from COVID, which again, the details for that are in the chat. And we also in that week launched the report that we've produced on healthcare utilisation in the last 2 years of life, which is perhaps the first product, one of the products of the Decision Support Centre is to produce a few big analytical reports a year, and this report was the first example of that. And it exemplifies some of the ways we intend to do those projects. So there's a headline report, there's a bespoke report for each system, but all of the analysis and the code is in open source and is available for local systems to run for themselves, to adapt, to learn from, and is freely available to the system. And that kind of use of open source code to do analysis is a fundamental underpinning philosophy for the Decision Support Centre. When we got to week 4, we were talking about inequalities. Inequality is one of those things people talk about a lot, isn't it? And we struggle to seem to do anything about it. But in this week, we started off with a session talking about gender inequality, drawing on the work of Caroline Criado Perez and Dr. Sarah Hillman at Warwick. Sadly, that session wasn't recorded, but we do need to do something about that, because some of that work is mind-bending in terms of understanding the extent to which we've created a whole sort of health service that is in effect structurally biased towards men. And so we will do something to make sure that that learning is made more generally available. We then had a session on homelessness and COVID, because we're lucky in the strategy unit, we've been asked to help evaluate the national effort to support people who are homeless during COVID. And we had our colleagues from Groundswell bringing very much the experience of homeless people to the table in terms of that discussion. And that evaluation report will be out soon. We then had a session on how COVID is affecting children and young people. And for that one, we brought together, well, quite an unusual mix of people. So we had a paediatrician, so children's public health person. We had a psychiatrist who specialises in transition points, Professor Swaran Singh. We had Sally Rowe, who's the children's lead from Walsall Council. And we had Nigel Osborne, who's a composer, but who spends 3 months of each year working with children in war zones, using music to try to support them. I really do recommend you try and watch that one if you fancy going back. It was fascinating, but it also gave us a chance to have some music, which we were happy about, and we're going to use that little bit of music at the end of this session with Nigel's permission. And we then had a session on COVID, inequalities and ethnicity, because some members of the strategy unit team have been doing some work with people in local communities to try and understand in much more depth their experience of COVID and what we can learn from that. And that piece of work being done partly out of frustration with some of the narrative that was prevalent around differences of experience for ethnic minorities at the time, where people seem to be leaping to too many assumptions about the causes for that. And we wanted to draw a richer picture of that. So that session presented that work. And then we had a great session at the end of the week with Professor Muir Gray, who many of you will know, Lucy Heath, who's the newly appointed director of, in effect, the DSU in the Black Country and West Birmingham, Dr. Fazana Hussain, who again pretty well known. I think she was the GP of the year or something. But anyway, she's a ball of energy and passion about this topic. Chris Bentley, who used to head the Health Inequalities Task Force, and they were exploring the essential question of how do we get from talking about health inequalities to being a service that actually does something about it. And again, I would say for anyone who's doing work on health inequalities or who's thinking of doing work on health inequalities, you'd be really well advised to spend an hour watching that session, because the amount of wisdom condensed into that and the ability of that session to fire you up is high. And I think would be a really great thing for anyone who's going to work on this, to get really fired up again about the fundamental reason for doing it. And then week 5, we were talking about decision-making toolkits. One of the things we want to do through the Decision Support Centre is try to build a greater extent of knowledge about the range of decision-making methods that are available to tackle different types of problem. So as in that week, we kind of had an introduction to that topic, and we published our Embracing Uncertainty, a guide to supporting decision-making in health and social care, was published in that week. Again, another resource for the Decision Support Network. We had a session on the learning programme that we're kicking off across the DSU network, with Professor Mohammed talking about the first 3 or 4 programmes that we're running. We had a joint session with the NHS-R community. Now, not everybody knows about this, our analysts do, but R is a globally used open source software for statistical analysis. And we're very lucky, Mohammed in the strategy unit has been leading the R community for the NHS over the last several years, funded by the Health Foundation. And in fact, they've got their conference on this week, and over 1,000 people across the NHS and elsewhere are registered for that conference this week. And the essence of R is that you do your work in that code, your work can then be openly shared with others who can see how it's been done, can use it themselves, can adapt it and share it. It's an organic approach to quality improvement and learning, and it's free. And it's used by industries and governments and so on across the world, but the NHS just hasn't used it very much. So part of our mission, and we'll come back to this a bit later, is to try and push the use of that as a powerful tool for democratising analysis. We then had a session with colleagues from the Health Foundation about the NHS as an anchor institution, which is a critical kind of topic to think about for the future. And we had a session on how to make sense of the COVID evidence base, and in particular the emerging evidence on long COVID. And we had a discussion about decision quality, which is a discipline with a set of codified ways of approaching about it, which again we want to try to introduce to the Midlands Decision Support Network as a way of measuring decision quality going forward. And then the last week, week 6, was kind of bringing it all together. So we had a session talking about how analysts can contribute to leadership. We had a nice film with Hashi Mohammed, who's an author who's written a book called People Like Us, about his experience of arriving in this country as a 9-year-old unaccompanied Sudanese refugee and becoming a barrister, and what he's learned from that, but also what he's learned from his own experience that he recognises can't be generalisable. And we were lucky, we happened to know him, so he did us an interview for an hour about what his experience tells us about health inequalities. And again, I really recommend you try and find the time to watch that film. It'll be available shortly. And then we had a session around decision quality with Al Mully, I think, thinking about how you share decision making, how you engage individuals, citizens, patients, public and so on in decision making. And then that all fed through to today. So that's that was the sort of logic. There was a sort of flow to it, actually. I think you can see. So today we're going to try and talk about the complexity of decision making. So I'll just introduce that quickly, and then you'll have enough of me then. So COVID's turned our world on its head. Past certainties that we, in our worldview, have collapsed around us. We face situations where we know little or nothing about something, and yet we know its effect has the potential to be huge. We've seen actions taken that, as we were taking them, we knew worsened the very things we said we wanted to improve. So health inequalities would be an example. We've seen here and abroad a whole set of challenges to the legitimacy of decision making at different levels. And we've also witnessed, I think, at speed, how decisions don't really happen in the way we think. So most of the shifts to the ways of working in response to COVID came ahead of formal decision making. Hospitals, through their own networks, hospitals with links to Italy, started to do things about intensive care before anyone told them to. Across primary care, there's certain closed social media groups where GPs were taking their lead from how to reorganise themselves from other GPs, not waiting to be told. And we had the public making choices about how to use services noticeably ahead of lockdown being declared. We've also seen the power of analytical modelling, but also its potential to mislead, and the danger of thinking that there's one version of the truth analytically. So that's an incredibly tough context for strategic decision makers. But before I ask the panel to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into them talking, which is what you're interested to hear. Late last night, and it was really late last night, it was about 10:30, popped into my email a little film from Sir Simon Stevens, who wanted to contribute his thoughts to this session. So we're just going to attempt to play that. So over to Janine to see whether we can do it.
I just wanted to take this opportunity to say congratulations to the new Midlands Decision Support Centre, and in particular all of the work that has been done so brilliantly over the last several months. We've seen during this coronavirus pandemic the vital importance not only of so-called frontline services, but also of the analysis, the information, the evaluation, as the health service has responded in flexible and agile terms to a range of new needs that have been presented to us, whether that's setting up new services for patients with so-called long COVID, whether it's mobilizing for the new COVID vaccination, whether it's overcoming some of the siloed working that has sometimes stood between joined up care in primary community services, the social care sector, as well as specialist hospital services. All of that has been fueled by information and by analysis, which has helped in real time improve the quality of the decisions that are being made. And so whether it's in the unusual situation where we find ourselves of actively promoting the uptake of care, help us help you, come forward for unmet need in cancer services or heart conditions or other parts of the non-COVID NHS, whether it's the focus that we clearly now need intentionally to tackle deep-seated health inequalities that COVID has shone a spotlight on, with all of the analytical underpinnings needed to be able to put together an actionable programme, whether it's the wider work to move towards the population health orientation that integrated care systems are going to deliver across the NHS. All of that, the rocket fuel for that is information and analysis and evaluation. And that, of course, is where you come in. It's where the role, the unseen role that you play, actually is so vital to the quality of care and the experience that patients have of the National Health Service. And so I simply, on behalf of the rest of the NHS, here to say thank you for what you are doing and strength to your elbows.
So there we are, strength to our elbows. There's mine. Right, I think, are we still missing Paul Moback? I think we are. So anyway, that's fine. The other three panelists will be happy to talk even more. So what I'm going to ask is for the three panelists who are here at the moment, if they could introduce themselves and say why they actually gave time to today, because my observation, I mean, we'll see what people say, but if we want systems to be learning systems and we want our staff to learn, we have to be prepared to give them the time to do so. So I'm interested that these three very busy, incredibly busy senior people chose to give an hour and a half to today. So if I could ask, perhaps start with you, Sally, if you could just introduce yourself, that would be great.
Great, thanks Peter. Good morning everybody. It's lovely to be with you all this morning. I'm Sally Warren. I'm the Director of Policy at the King's Fund, and before my time at the King's Fund I've spent around about 20 years in sort of national policy and delivery in the health and care system. Why am I here today? Partly because Peter's too nice to say no to, so when you get asked you say yes, but more seriously, obviously I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the King's Fund. Our mission is to help support the health and care system to deliver good care for all and to improve health for everybody. And we do that in particular by trying to combine our work and thinking on policy and research with some of our leadership practice, which is absolutely about thinking this isn't just about what's the best policy, but it's also about thinking how do you implement these policies and what are the skills and capabilities you need across the system to implement policies successfully to be able to improve outcomes. So it felt like today was a really good opportunity to bring together some of those strands and to hear from different colleagues about how they're contributing to that big challenge as well. So that's why we're here. I will kind of quickly add as well, although I knew it was the final session, I hadn't realised it was being done as a finale, and the word finale just has a slightly traumatic experience for me, because it was the word that when I was a small child, my inability to say the word was the thing that finally made my parents realise I should go to speech and language therapy as a small child. So I have now learned how to say it, but yeah, I was kind of slightly brought back to being sort of 7 and coming home from primary school and absolutely not being able to say the word, and my parents being very confused. So I'm very happy to be here at the closing session, less happy about it being a finale.
Okay. Oh, sorry for that, Sally. But anyway, it's a good story though, because you did just say it. Right. So, Danielle.
Thank you. So my name's Danielle Oom, Chair Walsall Healthcare NHS Trust. I also chair Walsall Housing Group, the social housing provider in Walsall. Soon to become chair of Birmingham Solihull Mental Health Trust. I'm also working currently with NHSEI and other leaders across the region on a working group focused on health inequalities. So I agreed to take part in this discussion, very much like Sally. It's very hard to say no, but actually, generally speaking, I do try to do these sorts of sessions when asked, because I think it's so important that despite how busy we are, that we do take the time to stop and think. And every time that you have to prepare for a session like this, you are organising your own thinking. So I think I get as much out of it as anything else anyway. I really love the idea of this festival, you know, taking the time to take stock, to share ideas, share learning. And whilst I haven't actually worked with the DSU, I'm a really strong proponent of having an evidence-based approach. I think that's what has served the NHS well in many areas, and some of the new areas where we're sort of jumping ahead of ourselves. I think it's important to take stock. So yeah, really glad, and I haven't even had to leave my own living room to be here. So thank you.
And you definitely win the award for the most striking background as well, Danielle, which is good. So Andy.
Thanks, Peter. So good morning, everyone. My name is Andy Williams. I'm the Chief Exec of the 3 Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland CCGs, and the system lead for the LLR system as well. My background is 36 years now in the NHS, 20 odd in Wales, and then the last dozen or so in England. First of all in the Black Country, and that's how I know Peter and key members of his team. We did quite a lot of work together actually over the years, and I've really benefited from and valued the input from the strategy unit. So I've had first-hand experience of how analytics can contribute to kind of decision making, and I'm really interested actually in this whole area and how the kind of process of decision making works, and the difference between how we think it works and how it really works. And I've got some personal insight of what happens when it goes wrong, because I've survived by the skin of my teeth in an earlier part of my career the mistake of believing there was such a thing as the right plan. And I'm very happy to kind of recount what that feels like when you realise that it doesn't really matter whether you're right or wrong. That's not how decisions work sometimes. So I've got some really, I think, pertinent and hopefully interesting insights into the way decisions are actually taken and what that means for the processes that we're going to be discussing, I think. So hopefully that will be of interest to colleagues as well.
That's great, thank you. So the way we're going to do it, everyone, is I've asked each, and just to double check, Paul, you aren't on, are you? Paul Moback? No. Okay, that's great. So the way we're going to do it is I've given the panelists have had homework. So so that they've each got 5 minutes, probably got 6 now because Paul's not showed up, but we'll try and keep it to 5. On a question that I asked them to talk on, and so each of them will have their soapbox effectively to talk about this question, and then after that, basically it then becomes a free-for-all. So at that point, I'm inviting the panel to talk to each other, to ask each other questions about what they've said, to explore understanding and so on. I've got some questions to chuck into that, but also critically we're looking for your questions as well. Everyone who's on the call and colleagues are monitoring the chat box, so please start as the thing goes on, put your questions into chat, and then we'll wrap that up at about 11:20. But I would really ask you to stay to the end, because as I said, we've got a little bit of music for you and a few other things. So I would really like it to, if you could stay till 11:30. So the question, I say the question, it's quite several questions actually. It's a bit of a tough one that we gave them, but it was that if you're going to have integrated systems or organisations, whatever, we're not really making a point here about structures, but if you're going to have those types of systems, if they're going to maintain the confidence of their public and their workforce whilst optimizing value and reducing health inequalities, what needs to characterize the way they make decisions and the way they lead? just as a bit of context to that question, one of the things Hashim Mohammed said when he did his session on health inequalities, in his experience, was he recounted how, in his experience, in several of the communities he knows, people regard the health service as not being their friend. And in some instances, they regard it as threatening. So this question of how decisions get made with legitimacy, particularly when we all say we want to address health inequalities, how are we going to make sure that we're learning from the people we seek to serve in how we make decisions? So anyway, on that note, so Danielle, you kindly agreed to kick us off.
Thank you. So for system leaders, I think in particular NHS leaders who are very accustomed to hierarchical structures, the need to establish and maintain effective partnerships requires the building of trusted working relationships. And I think this needs to be based on an agreed set of principles. You can't necessarily rely on traditional management controls. So in some respects, you could say that there's a role for NHSEI to help pull together guiding principles. But I've had a go at drawing together some of my own, based on my own extensive experience of partnership and collaboration, sometimes within the health and social care sector and other sectors too. So I would suggest a set of behavioural principles could include respecting the views of others and accepting that partners act in good faith, prioritising the interests of the population ahead of the organisation and any personal career interests, agreeing subsidiarity as the guiding principle for system decision making, establishing emotionally intelligent protocols, partnership values and behaviours, applying pragmatism with regards to regulatory challenges, and balancing risk and reward at system and organisational level. So we've got our behaviours agreed. Whilst it's not an exhaustive list, I would argue that without these basic behavioural principles, ICSs will remain a set of individual organisations yoked together by policy edict, rather than becoming collaborative systems that can respond to the needs of the populations they serve. So then for the ICS leaders to be equipped to be able to optimise the value from the resources available to the NHS and also partners, for me, this is really about the data, about the analysis and the intelligence that you derive from that, and that needs to be developed within and shared across systems. So leaders do need to have an understanding of the populations they serve. They need to know where the health inequalities are. They need to understand the unwarranted variations in care, the gaps in service provision, and also the perverse incentives that are increasing costs in the system. And that shouldn't be just limited to what's happening in the NHS. So an example, in Walsall, I chair the homelessness steering group, and it became clear that there wasn't a system approach in Walsall to the discharge of homeless people. So in the NHS, we were making decisions that was simply about the NHS, and people were being discharged without homes to go to, just creating a revolving door situation. So I think in addition, an open book approach to finances across the system, which is of course supported by the system by default edict and the move towards system control totals, but that really is only about NHS funding. And we also need to evaluate and understand the impact of decisions and interventions on the long-term system goals for population health. So last but not least, for ICS leaders to be up to the task of addressing inequalities, first of all, they need to understand this is not a newfangled responsibility, it's a legal duty. The NHS founding principles included universality and equity. The 2012 Act gave NHSE legal duty to reduce inequalities across access and outcomes, and the Equality Act 2010 established the public sector duty to address equality. So it's the law. And then ensuring that improving health and workforce inequalities is a mainstream activity. It's got to be core to and not peripheral to the NHS and its partners. We need to adopt population health, prevention and health inequalities as a core priority. We need to agree system health inequalities plans at ICS level, which outlines ambitious goals and objectives for improvement. The process for planning and delivering those commitments should involve full engagement with the community and third sector groups, new and supportive relationships with care homes. There needs to be identification of sufficient capacity to coordinate health inequalities work across the system, and the intelligence strategy and KPIs to underpin that. And it should be shared and transparent so that we can see the progress. We also need to strengthen accountability to the local population, listen to their concerns, particularly to those who are at risk of health inequalities. Data should be regularly published at the lowest meaningful geographical level possible to support this. And then we need to establish arrangements for ongoing leadership development to build expertise, insight and skills, because for a lot of people this is a new area and it is going to be an increasingly important priority. So we've got the people board, the people plan priorities, making our people promise a reality. Systems should work to implement that, work with HEE and NHSEI regional teams to further develop competency-based workforce approaches. So, quick example, Regional Talent Board in the Midlands established the required competencies for leaders, which included taking a system perspective. This is the list of competencies: finds new solutions, initiates and drives transformation, engages and aligns others, takes on conflicts for the greater good, brings compassion and inclusion, develops people and brings a learning mindset. So I think if all of us agreed that we were going to adopt those competencies and measure performance against those, that would take us a long way forward. So finally, because I think I might be at the end of my 5.5 or 6 minutes, I'm going to say that interventions to address health inequalities must be evidence-based, must have meaningful prospects of measurable success. And what we need to think about is the agency of the NHS. It is immense. We are not passive people standing by while health inequalities happens on our watch. The investment decisions that we make deliver impact. Whether those are the impacts that we choose is down to us. So we need to ensure that our investment decisions lead to impacts that reduce health inequalities rather than maintaining or increasing them.
Thank you. We'll come back to some of what you said in the conversation, but if Andy, are you happy to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So thank you. I'm going to talk not from an academic perspective here, because I have no special expertise, but I do have, as I said, 30 odd years of experience, and I kind of approach it in a slightly different way. So I think, I hope this is kind of helpful, but I kind of conceptualize this thing more as a set of human relations than as a kind of a scientific process. And I'll explain a little bit about the balance of that going forward. So I guess thinking about particularly the perspective of an ICS, it's probably worth by saying something out loud that defines how governance works generally in the UK. And you can summarize it very simply, really. People who are elected make decisions. People who are appointed provide advice and implement. And as a, if you wanted a shorthand version of the British Constitution, that's kind of it. The problem this gives for legitimacy for ICSs is who elected us? How does that actually work? We're not even statutory bodies. And so I think that, ICSs start conceptually with quite a burden of proof to say, well, what's the legitimacy of what you're doing? Their conception, I think, is about trying to deliver more effectively to the national democratic mandate that the government have as the elected body and the Secretary of State translates into policy. So I think they're a device to get a better adherence to policy implementation, but they're often judged on the extent to which they deliver against local accountability. And I think that is one of several dualities that describes the challenge of decision making in an ICS. So are we implementing national policy against a democratic mandate to a national government, or are we accountable locally for the implementation decisions we make, even though we don't have a mandate democratically at that level? And how do we balance those processes? So that's the first dilemma, really. The second dilemma, I think, is that we have within the health service and the public service generally, it seems to me, two competing ethical frameworks that drive our decision making, and they both run simultaneously, and they often lead you to different conclusions. There are several ways you can kind of define ethics, but I always think of it in terms of two basic models. One is the kind of utilitarian, you do the most good for the most number of people with the resources you've got, which is typically how many decisions are evaluated, particularly kind of structural investment major decisions. But the second issue, of course, is rights-based, deontological, so everyone has a basic entitlement to. And a perfect example for me of this is the way we commissioned ambulance services in the West Midlands. We had a great ambulance, we have a great ambulance service in the West Midlands. It delivers at the West Midlands level every target it has to deliver, but it doesn't deliver those targets equally to the whole population universally across the West Midlands. And so it delivers it in aggregate. It's utilitarian, absolutely nails it. But if you look at it as a rights-based issue, we'd actually have to invest, manage and hold it to account completely differently. And yet we are often judged by the extent to which we meet the rights, you know, the 4-hour wait, the minimum waiting time standard, the access standards, human rights, those kinds of things. So there are minimum rights that we have to adhere, but we're often trying to make decisions on the basis of the greatest good. And I think that's a real issue for ICSs actually, because almost inherent in the thinking of an ICS is a utilitarian ethic, you know, that we're trying to maximize benefit for the wider population, possibly sometimes at the expense of more local populations or particular segments of the population. And often when I see conflict in public consultation, it's because someone is arguing from a rights-based perspective against a utilitarian analysis. And I think that's the second big dilemma. I think that the third dilemma that we have to deal with as an ICS is that we're working with two different truths. So a lot of our staff, perhaps the majority, are scientifically trained. They believe in the sense that there is an absolute truth. Double-blind randomized control trials tell you whether a drug works or not. Public policy is not evidence-based. It never has been, and it probably never will be. And it's judged politically. It's based on values, on ideology, on politics in an absolute sense. And so the idea that we're often required as leaders to justify scientifically things which in truth are ideological is very difficult. I've got a perfect case now. I'm trying to persuade 136 practices in my area that they should all vote to merge. I'm doing that because the policy is we should have a single CCG. There's very little scientific evidence to show that will improve anything much actually, but I'm dressing up a lot of what I present with a sort of a scientific overcoat, when in fact at its heart is very clearly a philosophical or ideological principle. And so we're talking different languages to different people. You know, local politicians will have a political perspective. Staff may have a very scientific perspective, particularly some of them who will want to see evidence. They won't just take your word for it. They'll want to see the facts and figures. And sometimes it can be very difficult to make policy arguments using scientific evidence. And that's a dilemma for our decision making. And then I think the kind of final issue for me is issues about subjective versus objective. I mentioned in my kind of introduction, I made at an earlier point in my career, perhaps halfway through it, I went to kind of battle, if you like, with a community over a very clear piece of evidence that showed that a change needed to happen. I'm convinced to this day that I was right, but the point is it didn't matter. No one cared about that because that wasn't the point. What I was trying to do was to change something that had an importance to the community that was described in completely different terms. It was symbolic of the vitality of the community. It was a treasured piece of infrastructure. It was something that they contributed to the community hospital. You can guess what it's going to be. But the evidence that it needed to change didn't matter. No one cared, frankly, and it wasn't the point. The point was I was talking to them about the wrong things in the wrong way, and it just didn't play. And it became such a problem because I became so infatuated with the evidence that I lost the sense of what the argument was actually about. Now, that's not a recipe for saying sort the evidence either, because you clearly can't go to that extreme. But the point is there's a balance here, and it often seems to me that conflict around decision making is when you get people correctly talking from different perspectives. They're both right. And often you see multiple legitimate perspectives, and we're trying to kind of solve that by proving one or other is absolutely correct, when in fact we need to recognize that's not the case, and that what we're resolving here is a legitimate difference of perspective and opinion. And I think that takes you into a different place in terms of the way in which you make those decisions and structure them, really. Just a kind of couple of final thoughts about how you actually then pick your way through that process. And it seems to me that ICSs have got a couple of things to work through, really. The first thing I think is to be really clear about the types of decisions they want to make. I think it was Danielle who mentioned the principle right early on in her opening about subsidiarity. And I think that's a really important point, because I think if ICSs believe it's their job to decide everything, you will create a huge distance between the people who are affected by a decision and the people taking it. And generally that leads to kind of dissent and poor outcomes. So I think it's really important ICSs concentrate only on those things which they need to do, which is typically the what question, the broad setting of strategic intent and direction and the broad allocation of resource. But don't get drawn into imposing solutions. Remove barriers, create opportunity, but don't start telling people how to do things, particularly at a highly localized level, and particularly if you're going to tackle issues around health inequity, because standardization aggravates inequity, it seems to me. So it's a disaster, and our fixation with removing unwarranted variation, whilst it's really important in quality and efficiency terms, can actually smother warranted variation and make inequity worse. So you've got to get the decision-making hierarchy right and reserve only to the ICS those things which it genuinely can do. And for God's sake, don't go anywhere near anything else. Push that out, delegate it. Otherwise, you're going to make some really howling decisions and get a lot of unhappiness. And I guess that the characteristics, therefore, thinking about how to manage all these dualities, the first thing I think is to let go of the notion that there is such a thing as the right answer, in an absolute sense. There are multiple right answers depending on multiple legitimate perspectives. So understand that we're making decisions in that context, not in a randomized controlled trial where we're proving that X outcome is better than Y or X decision is better than Z. It isn't that kind of decision making that we're getting into. So don't come at it that way. Come at it in the way of understanding it as a political issue, I think. And then some characteristics that seem to me to be kind of universally appropriate. How will good decisions be made? Well, first of all, there's that understanding, but then there are three characteristics that really stand out for me as almost always being important. I can't think of a situation where they wouldn't be. Transparency. Who's making the decision, how, about what, on what basis, in what way, over what time frame? How clear is this decision-making process? Where's the transparency? Where's the integrity is the second issue. Who's making it? Are they conflicted? Have they taken the time to check? Is that transparent? How do you kind of surface conflicts of interest? How do you ensure that people behave from a value base that is consistent with public life and the responsibilities they've given, whether that's Nolan or something else? But you've got to have integrity, particularly in non-elected bodies. Integrity goes to the absolute heart of good decision making, and it's really important to get that right. And then finally, accountability. To whom is this body accountable really, and how is that accountability discharged? And it's really important to be honest about that, so that we don't create faux accountabilities or pretend accountabilities that make people across. You know, if at the end of the day, the accountability lies in a particular way against a particular set of policies, part of our transparency is to say that and to be honest about it and not dress up a decision that's made in one place with a justification that plays to another audience. You know, let's be honest about what we're trying to do and be clear about how that accountability is discharged. So recognize the complexity of decision making, be transparent about it, act with integrity, and I think maintain a clear sense of accountability. And that feels to me like the best way that ICSs have got of making decisions that will be understood actually by all of the participants and stakeholders, whether that's centrally or locally, to whom they have to account. So hope that's helpful as a kind of a set of opening thoughts. Yeah.
Just one thing on that, Andy, your thing about the utilitarian dilemma. I thought the exams results crisis was a fascinating demonstration of that.
Yeah.
Because from a utilitarian perspective, avoiding generalized grade inflation, ensuring a similar distribution of grades across the population, that all seemed like a very sensible objective. But the minute that turned into downgrading someone from a C to an unclassified because they happen to fall in place. So yeah, I think it's a great thing to draw out. Yeah, thank you for that. Ali, to you.
Great. Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Danielle and Andy. Before mainly talking about kind of culture and ways of working in decision making, I'm just going to briefly reflect on structures, partly because the NHS does love a structure, but also because the stage we are at as a system with integrated care system is that we are very likely to enter a 12-month period where there's quite a lot of intense discussion about structure with rumoured NHS legislation. And I think from what we've heard from Andy and Danielle, structure isn't going to be everything. Certainly from what you'll hear from me, it's not everything. It can absolutely undermine some of the cultural things that we are all talking about, really important. But and at best, all it can do is help create an environment where the culture we want to see does thrive and happen. But structure by itself will not drive the kind of shift in outcomes that we want to see. So I'm deliberately not talking much about structures today, but I think it is worth all of us kind of flagging the risk that the next 12 months is dominated entirely by structures and governance and parliamentary bills rather than the kind of real stuff about how we work together. But so if I then think about the exam question, the homework that Peter gave to me, I suppose in answering it, I'm drawing on the King's Fund has been leading a community of practice with integrated care systems, the first wave and now the next wave. So we've got a lot of experience about how are these emergent systems establishing themselves, how are they dealing with the reality of complex relationships and difficult decisions. So it's drawing on that experience where I've got 5 main reflections on how we kind of make this shift and what the essential ingredients are. The first is an absolute focus on purpose. So if you are all aligned behind a purpose and that purpose is health inequalities rather than healthcare delivery, that just fundamentally shifts how you think about what your task is, how you think about what your relationships are. And we've certainly seen the more advanced and mature ICSs have that as absolutely the heart of everything they do, and it does really shift things in quite a different way. So that focus on purpose, really important. It makes you think differently. That then links for me with my next point about being really clear about who your partners are. And again, if you're thinking about health inequalities, you can think much more broadly about who your partners are. And this is where I need to give the NHS a bit of tough love. So I've spent a lot of my time in national policy working in public health and in social care. So working as a partner to the NHS rather than in the kind of middle of the NHS. The NHS can be pretty difficult to partner with. The NHS partners on its own terms, not on the terms of the collective desire of partners. It can be really hard. And I know that's because of the pressures and issues and the culture within the system. So it's a very complex kind of set of drivers as to why that happens, but it is unfortunately the reality. But if you want ICSs to really work, that has to shift. That has to shift to being a genuine partnership where there are lots of different players who can contribute to improving health inequalities. The NHS is absolutely one of those, but by itself, it's not going to be able to solve that dilemma. So I think for me, it's about being really clear about who your partners are, being broad in that interpretation. So it's the voluntary sector, it's local authorities, it's your business and civic community, it is your local communities, and it's not just knowing who your partners are, but genuinely having an equal partnership. So that draws on some of the points about trusting each other that Danielle set us off with this morning. Linked to that then is my third point, which is how you listen and act rather than just engage. And again, I think this is too often engagement can feel like it's a task that needs to be done. You know, we've got to consult on this, we've got to engage in this, rather than being seen as an active and critical part of decision making, because really getting the insight of local communities is absolutely critical. So how do you engage? How are you then transparent about how you're engaging, who you're engaging with, and what you're doing on the back of that information? So be transparent about how you're listening and how you're acting, which I think is really important. The fourth point for me, and really pleased that this has been picked up by others as well, is I kind of talk about systems within systems. So this is the point about subsidiarity, which I do normally struggle to say, where ICSs cannot and should not do everything. They are quite large geographies. Let's be honest, most members of the public will feel no sense of identity to an ICS. It's a completely odd footprint created for administrative purposes. None of us feel a connection to that. Most people wouldn't be able to say even what system they live in. So actually, most of the work that will be done that will really drive improved outcomes will be happening at a place level and at a neighbourhood level. So actually, how can you be clear that the culture you set within an ICS is about allowing those levels to thrive and work really well, but then reserving for the system the things which have to happen at a system level. And that might not look the same in every single system. So actually, you know, what works at a system level in London may well be quite different to what works in West Yorkshire. You might actually need some things that work at a system level in West Yorkshire, you need at a regional level in London. So I think we need to get comfortable that universal doesn't mean uniform in these structures, and kind of one size fits all doesn't work given the different footprints. So we particularly in the King's Fund have been doing work on place-based work within systems, and a real anxiety that we hold, but actually I think most ICS leaders hold as well, that actually the more focus that's happening at ICS level, the risk is that there's a separation of the relationship with local authorities and with communities at a place-based level, and that would be well, that would fundamentally undermine the purpose and what we're trying to achieve by tackling health inequality. So that systems within systems is, I think, really really critical. And then for me, there's a final point about data and information. So these systems are going to have to make really difficult decisions. We always make difficult decisions in the health and care system. We're talking about finite resources, tackling major problems. Our decisions are always life and death and quality of life decisions. It might not be about an immediate, might not be death tomorrow, but it's always life and death. So how can we make sure we are as informed as we can be about decisions? Bearing in mind, we don't have a level playing field when it comes to the amount of data available in different parts of our sector. We don't have a shared understanding about what makes good evidence. So it's kind of going to Andy's point about there are parts of our system that think all evidence must be scientific, RCT, and that's the only thing that matters. There's other parts of our system where you would never have RCT type data, but there still is relevant information and insight that should be taken into decisions. So I think, how do ICSs get a shared understanding of what does evidence mean and what does data mean, and really critically, where are your data blind spots? And that shouldn't stop you acting, it just should make you think about insight and information in a different way, and how do you fill those blind spots in different ways through community engagement, through wider discussion. So I think that for me is really, really key as we get to really complex issues where, you know, how you tackle health inequalities, it's really, really difficult to work out, should I do A or B, you know, or how much of A do I do and how much B do I do, and how quickly will that have an impact, and how will I know if it's having an impact? So it's going to be really complex, and I think having that shared understanding about data, insight, information, and how you bring together different people with different understanding of evidence, and how you make decisions is critical. So I think my conclusion is the key bit for me around how do you what the essential ingredients are, and kind of how we can really shift people's confidence in ICS is it's focus on the purpose of reducing health inequalities. It's about making sure you've got relationships that are genuine and trusted with your wide range of partners. An absolutely key thing around levels within the system, and what's data, insight, analysis, and how you can begin to have a shared understanding of how you manage decisions where you have inequity and what the data available is. So back over to you, Peter.
Thank you. That was terrific. Great range of approaches to the question, actually, which has given real richness. Just on one thing you said, Andy, just before I ask a question. This will sound like I keep quotes in my head. I don't, but I was just looking last night for a quote to potentially put at the tail end of this session, and I came across one from Einstein, because he's got lots of quotes, obviously. But he said, any number of experiments can't prove I'm right, but one experiment can prove I'm wrong, which I thought was a really neat way of approaching the dilemma. And if we're going to recognise that a lot of what we do is experimenting, then we have to create experimental conditions, which may not be random controls trial, but if you're going to kick off experiments and you don't even bother to put in place something that allows you to measure what effect it's having, then you've kind of failed at the first hurdle. So it does seem to me that if we embrace the idea that a lot of what we do is experimental, we need to create conditions to become learning systems to embrace that. I'll ask colleagues if there's questions that have come up, because I haven't been able to track the chat, unfortunately. But Danielle, can I just ask you one clarification? You said something in yours. You talked about I think the phrase was something like emotionally intelligent protocols. I think it was something like that. Could you just enlarge on that?
So when you're working in partnership, and it can be any sector, my background is regeneration, so it was working with a lot of different agencies, including out in different community settings as well. And those partnerships need to be genuine, and they need to be based on mutual understanding and respect. And for a lot of, well, particularly public sector organisations, but you could say the same of any large corporate organisation going out and working in the community with people who've got less power, less positional power, less financial power, etc. If you're working in a partnership and you come in with the assumption that your point of view is what counts, then it's really difficult, and the behaviours that can go alongside that really detract from being able to make any genuine progress. So I actually think it's worth taking time at the start to agree how you're going to behave with each other and committing to it. And then you've got something that you can hold up and say, oh, that's not what we agreed. You know, we did say that we would listen to each other. We would assume that when people express a point of view, they're doing so because they're trying to make a contribution, even if you don't agree with them. We're not going to undermine each other and assume that certain people are naive or don't have anything to contribute really, etc. So those sorts of things can really detract. It's about being human, isn't it?
Okay, no, that's great. So I think there's like a general theme across all of you that that it's very rare that data analysis can tell us the answer. I mean, lots of people like to talk about one version of the truth, which I find a terrifying concept, actually, but people seem to think it's a good idea. I think they might mean, can we agree that if the number's 2 here, that it's also 2 here? But even that actually is not always possible. But if we agree that what analysis can do is help increase understanding, possibly narrow uncertainties around decisions which typically are value-based or political decisions in the way Andy described. we need leaders who are comfortable in understanding that analysis. So what do you think, don't mind who answers this first, do you think we're doing enough to support the leaders we've got to feel confident in how they work with analysis and evidence?
From my point of view, Peter, I'm not sure that we are. I think it's interesting. I had a chance to spend a little bit of time quite a while back now with another healthcare system. Went to the States and looked at Kaiser and the way they systematically approached innovation, and they used a very structured process with very clear evidence and control charts to get rid of kind of standard cause variation and all that sort of stuff when they were evaluating the impact of decisions. And I don't feel that we do that enough, to be honest. I still think that we don't look for evidence sufficiently rigorously, and we probably start from a confirmatory rather than a falsifying perspective. So we're looking for things that tell us we're doing the right thing rather than checking for evidence that suggests we might not be, and then acting accordingly. And I think that's a difference in, you know, in kind of managerialism versus science, isn't it? You know, we're trying to justify often what we're doing as opposed to taking a skeptical approach and only being convinced it's right once we've got evidence that can't be falsified, or, you know, it's a different sort of standard. I don't think we've got that kind of working through, and partly I think that's because there's an expediency to the managerial agenda sometimes. I remember one of those conversations that sticks in your head when I was quite junior. I worked with a very senior civil servant in what was then the Welsh office. And I went to him very excited one day because I realised that England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland were all approaching the same issue in slightly different ways. And I talked to him about, you know, with the Confed, I could do a kind of a control experiment and we could see which policy worked best. And he kind of just put his hand on my shoulder and said, the thing you've got to understand is, Andy, nobody cares. And he just kind of set me away. And it's like some policies don't stand evaluation, but there are some things we definitely should evaluate. And I think trying to get that balance, you know, better, it would be helpful, I think. I don't think we look at evidence sufficiently rigorously enough at board level, for example.
Yeah.
Sally? Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly as well. So I think it's a really important question, and I think the simple answer is we need to do more to help the kind of the current generation and the future generation of leaders in the NHS understand data and analysis and how to handle the ambiguity of that, with which it's ambiguous whilst giving a pretense of certainty. And I suppose why do I think we need to do more? There's a bit that says we have a whole generation of senior leaders who are in senior leadership roles because they've done very well in operational management jobs in the NHS and are now being asked to lead extremely complex systems of relationships rather than necessary delivery. So it's a different leadership task than it was. If you look at who the ICS chairs are and leads, executive leads, I think that's quite informative about the scale of challenge that's seen about these roles. So most of the chairs, not all of them, but most of the chairs are at a certain stage in their career where they've been there and done it, and therefore kind of are feeling a bit like they can take a risk with this role, and they are experienced and high profile enough to be able to speak truth without it feeling like it's going to impact on their future progression. The leads, again, there's a lot which are at a certain stage in their career. There is a lot of concern amongst that group of leads about what the succession pipeline is, where the next generation of ICS leaders comes from, because actually we don't have a lot of people who have got experience in providers and commissioners. It tends to be you've been in one silo or another. So I think there is a real challenge there about how we create a kind of pipeline of leaders that have the right kind of culture around leadership with the right technical competence, be that around data analysis, digital, a whole set of issues. So I think it is a really important challenge for us.
Danielle, anything you wanted to add on that topic?
Not much, just to remind people that in my talk, I mentioned the fact that the Regional Talent Board in the Midlands had developed specific competence. This is about 1.5 years ago now. But obviously it's now time to reignite those. But it doesn't address the fact that those will be applied to new leaders coming in. We've got a whole range of leaders who, as Sally said, came up through one route and are now being required to work in a very different way. And I think we need quite an intensive development program, really.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think there's a big risk that we're not going to be able to deliver.
Yeah. Can I just check with colleagues if there's any questions coming up in the chat that we ought to give some attention to before I carry on? David?
Yeah, I mean, the questions are broadly related to accountability and addressing health inequalities. So we've got a question around how can we effectively balance local accountability and collaborative decision making conducted in the way set out by today's panelists with satisfying the needs of central regulators. So I think that draws on the three conversations that I've had. And then around health inequalities, you know, there's been a few points around the role of leadership in reducing health inequalities is critical. So how do we ensure the focus from leadership is on this across systems, and where does the accountability from this lie? So they've been the two sort of key themes that have come out of the chat box so far.
Okay. Can I kind of encapsulate a couple of those in a question? So if we accept that that we're in a zero-sum game at one level or another, there's a certain amount of resources available for health service, and we believe that there are sections of the population we serve who are not getting an appropriate level of service, how are we going to decide what we're going to reduce in order to increase availability for those who currently don't get a good deal?
So I think it's one of the key challenges that every system's wrestling with, Peter, I think, isn't it? And it seems to me that from the two systems I've been part of, the way we've begun to approach it practically, I think, is to do two things at the same time. First of all, I think we've tried to imagine strategically what a better balanced system would look like in terms of how we want to align the kind of allocative strategy, if you like. So how much are we spending on physical as opposed to mental health? How much on children as opposed to adults? How much on, you know, treating illness as opposed to preventing it? Those kinds, you know, let's try and sort of take a view and look at benchmarks, other systems, any evidence we can find that might help us get that kind of broad allocative strategy right as a way of evidencing a rebalancing of the system. And then at the same time, but in a completely different way from the bottom up, we started looking at where are the opportunities for efficiency, where's waste, where is the chance for better targeted resource. And so you take a whole bunch of kind of local actions that are designed to kind of improve efficiency and release resource, create opportunity so that you generate some work locally. And I think, so certainly from our point of view, it's that kind of combination of the two that's designed to try and create a movement. It will be right at the margins though, you know, I mean, we're talking about single percentage movements over several years, you know, because the NHS has got such a lot of fixed and semi-variable costs. It's actually, there's a rate of transformation that's difficult to sustain beyond quite a low level. But having said that, the gearing effect means that those can be, you know, 0.5% saved on acute care is a colossal investment in primary prevention for children, for example. So there's a huge gearing effect that can happen. And I think systems, certainly ours, are looking for those kinds of opportunities as a way of making that happen.
Sally? Yeah.
Yeah, great, thanks. It's a pretty difficult question, Peter, isn't it? So I'm just going to slightly not accept the premise of your question before then being a good panelist and answering the question, don't worry. So you talked about there being a finite amount of resource for the health service. So we'll obviously say the health system is more than the health service.
Yeah.
And I think we have seen in pretty brutal focus that a decade where the NHS has been the relative winner in a spending review at the expense of public health and social care has been very, very unstabilising for the system as a whole and been pretty devastating for individuals that rely on those services. So I think there is always a question for us about how do we think about the collective resource and how we best advocate for the collective resource in the system. But that said, in terms of how do we make those decisions about what we focus on, I think here there is a really important role for national, because if, and I'll kind of make it specific to the current dilemma we are going to be in for the next 3 years is, does national bodies and the government can they tolerate waiting times being still pretty awful for perfectly good reasons? We understand what's happened with COVID, but being awful for 4 or 5 years, or are they going to want you to rush through a massive backlog to try and demonstrate that performance is good? Or actually, are they going to have an honest conversation with the public to say, we can't get that performance back quickly enough for all of these reasons, and if we try and get it back quickly enough, actually it could increase health inequalities because it reduces our capacity and ability to do anything else in the health system. So I think you need some things done nationally, which is an honest conversation about what's possible and the trade-offs. That then should set a clear overall strategy that should always give enough space locally to be able to have some local priorities about particular inequalities, because I think there is a real dilemma that the real desire to think about inequalities at a local level could be really undermined if there's a kind of if we revert to national performance management about a set of targets that nobody in the system actually thinks can be delivered right now. So I think the balance of national bravery about those decisions with local space to then, within that overall set of parameters, to focus on the things that matter for that individual community.
Danielle?
Yep, so I would agree with both Andy and Sally, and I would add that the anchor institution approach, the involving voluntary sector, involving housing, the example I gave before about rough sleepers not being discharged onto people being supported into jobs. When I used to work at the QE in the first NHS regeneration team, that was our mantra. The best thing you can do for someone's health is to get them into work. So, you know, all of those approaches add to the resource that we're talking. It isn't a finite resource at all, actually. It's much more than the NHS budget. If we can align that and focus, we've got a lot of shared objectives through the ICS, through the places, then we can achieve a lot more together.
Great. So we're a couple of minutes before I just need to wrap up. Can I just ask you for a last thought on, and obviously it's just slightly different perspectives for each of you, but on your thoughts on the potential importance of the kind of network that we're trying to build here for addressing some of the issues you've raised. So perhaps Andy, kick off with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. I think, well, I think it is really important, actually, for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think, having said there's all these dualities, which I still believe, the role of consistent information and evaluation is more important perhaps now than ever. You know, it has to be taken in that context, but that is not a reason to be sloppy about evidence or evaluation. You know, in fact, arguably we need it more than ever, really. I think those skills are relatively rare, and to develop them to a very high standard, we're better off acting collectively than not. So I think it is an example where you would expect to see collaboration, and that is what this network's kind of represents, really. So I really strongly support it. I do think we need that kind of repository of good practice and expertise, because it's very difficult to stand up at short notice if you don't invest in it continuously, and you need to draw a lot of work from a big area to justify and maintain that kind of expertise going forward. So, you know, perhaps not surprisingly, because I'm sat on this call and all the rest of it, but I do advocate for it strongly, as you know, and as I said before, that I've seen the value of it directly in some of the kind of more controversial changes that I've had to make in my time working in the NHS in England. So I'm a big supporter of that approach, to be honest.
Thanks, Andy. Sally, you're kind of an outsider looking in, but I don't know whether you've got any observations.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd just to build briefly on what Andy said, I think any network where you can be sharing learning and experience is really important. There'll be a whole set of things around the kind of technical skills and abilities that you want to share, but I think there's also something about sharing and learning from your successes and failures. So where have you been able to convince people on a with an evidence base that isn't a gold-plated RCT? What was it about the nature of that relationship, how you engage with the issue, how you engage with the decision because what from that can you then learn and apply to other circumstances. So I think there's an awful lot about not just the what you do, but the how you do it as people who are supporting difficult decisions that need to be made. So I think that's a really important side of things, and that kind of creating a network where you can be honest with each other about the successes and the failures takes some time. So you want to keep that kind of constantly going and bubbling in the background, because it's not something you can just turn on and off. You can't kind of suddenly go, once a year please share your deepest failures of the last year with each other and what you can learn from it. It needs to be a much more rolling sense of successes and failures and reflections.
Yeah. Danielle.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's really important. I think it's really important that this thinking and sharing of the learning is happening. But I would also like to see a little bit more take up, I suppose, in the mainstream, so that people who don't necessarily make time for this are encouraged and supported to get involved, whether it is to join an event like this, or to actually take this approach when they're considering decisions that they need to make in, in their everyday work.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, fantastic contributions, and thank you for taking the time to participate today, and thank you for taking the time to do your homework, which is always extremely unwell. You know, not only were you nice enough to accept, but then to be given a task beforehand. I thought that was terrific, and huge amount of appreciation for that. We're going to take this. We are running till 11:30, folks. I'm really keen you stay because we want to play you some music. But if we can just get the slide up, Janine. Before we do the music, I'm just going to do. This is the Oscar moment, really. There's just a few stats there for you about the festival. Some good stuff there, actually. I think. I mean, for us, the fact this is the finale, for some of my team, there's a definite sigh of relief today. It's been really relentless, actually. But also, hopefully, a big sense of satisfaction for having pulled it off. I want to thank all of the participants, the huge number of people who've participated as speakers, and the people who've given their time to come and be an audience for the event, because these are that it takes both. To thank all of those people for giving their time to this. I particularly want, it's invidious, but I particularly want to thank Rachel Caswell and David Callahan from the strategy unit, because they've been the beating heart of making this work. Many others have contributed hugely, but there's always a couple of people who, if it wasn't for them, the whole thing would have fallen over. And in this instance, that's David and Rachel. And I do also want to thank Derek Kitchen and Midlands and Lancashire CSU, because Derek recognises the value of creating an environment in which space can be created to become a learning organisation. And Derek's created the space in which we're able to operate in the way we do, and in which we're able to start doing what we're doing to try and help build the Midlands Decision Support Unit. And also I want to thank all of the systems across the Midlands, not the West Midlands, gosh, I could get in trouble for that, who've agreed to buy into this Decision Support Unit concept. It's a bit of a leap of faith. And the fact they've bought into it and that they've placed some trust in us to try to help get it going is I think a bold step. We're certainly going to do everything we can to make that work for the systems, and to help people in tackling the kinds of problems our panelists have talked about today. So I want to end with a little medley. So what you're getting here, if it works, then it should do, is some feedback that we've had from the various sessions, the various panels and so on that we've run, and they'll come up as a series of breaks, and some music by Nigel Osborne, who I mentioned earlier. And if you can just let this run through for 3.5 minutes, and then we'll just wrap up with a big wave. Okay, so everybody, that was a piece by Nigel Osborne. It's on a CD by the Hebrides Ensemble, the chamber music of Nigel Osborne. It's atypical. I warn you, the rest of the music's much thornier than that. But anyway, we've kind of developed a tradition, which is at the end, if everyone on the call could put their cameras on, and then in the usual style, show please your appreciation for our fantastic panelists in what I think's been a really great session. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for giving your time. Okay. So Andy, Danielle, Sally, thank you again. It was terrific.